Now, today we will be talking about Lenin's work Left-Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder, which deals with his relation to the so-called ultra-left. So before we begin, just let us talk about what these terms actually mean. So what's left-wing communism? You would think that communism is always left-wing. So why does Lenin talk here about left-wing communism as something he rejects? So the thing is that the term left and right within the communist movement describe two basic camps. So like the right would be the ones who are more pragmatic in a certain sense, or more, for example, economically it would mean that you make more compromises with the ruling classes, that you don't, for example, immediately take all the means of production into the hands of like the society, but instead you would accept a certain amount of private property still existing, at least in the beginning. Whereas the more left-wing position would be to immediately socialize all the means of production. And the same could be said about politics, where you could say that the right-wing position would be more aligned with more authoritarian means or more parliamentary means, whereas the left-wing position would be more radically democratic. So there is this kind of left-right spectrum also under the socialists. So you can say that for a socialist, this person is more left-wing or more right-wing. Now, Lenin is opposed to both left-wing and right-wing deviations in socialism. But of course, we have to remember that it's always a question of perspective. So for Lenin, left-wing is everything that's left of him, whereas right-wing is everything that's right of him. Okay, so now we have like a basic idea about what left-wing and right-wing means in this context. Why is it called an infantile disorder? Because Lenin basically believes that left-wing deviations are less severe than right-wing deviations. So right-wing deviations, which they also called at that time opportunism, if you are like a reformist or you reject the proletarian revolution or you want to move too slowly with implementing socialism, he thinks that this is a much more serious problem, whereas left-wing communism is more or less something that will die out if the movement matures. So it's an infantile disorder, something that every socialist movement experiences when it's still young. Okay, so yeah, what you have to know, what you have to remember now is just that it's a polemic against left-wing communism. This is what we are going to talk about. First, the historical context. Secondly, Lenin's ideas about the success of the Bolsheviks and why they were successful. Third thing is his account of reactionary trade unions, 4 bourgeois parliaments. Then the fifth is his discussion of compromise. And then we will just wrap up things and talk a little bit about what this all means for us today. Historical context. So one of the most important things you always have to remember when you read some text is, of course, when was it written and why was it written? Because in a certain sense, it's also always a historical source. And we have to know who wrote it, why this person wrote it, what did they want to achieve, and how is this related to the historical situation in which they were writing their things. So the left-wing communism pamphlet has been written in 1920, which is after the revolution. This is especially important with regard to the works of Lenin, because you can clearly see that some things change, whether he's in power or not. So it's always interesting to keep this in mind if you read something by Lenin. Did he write this as a politician who is actually ruling a country, or did he write this as an activist who's maybe like persecuted by the police and he's just like a fringe figure in some really radical left-wing group? So yeah, this was written when the Bolsheviks were in power, which was in 1917 when they made the October Revolution. So 1920 is obviously after that. So what happened in 1920? What was the situation in Russia? The situation was really bad. Russia was still fighting the really brutal civil war. And it was really like death and destruction. It was famine, cold, hunger, murder. Think of the Congo War or something like that. It's really terrible. There was also a pandemic, the Spanish flu, which was much worse than COVID. So just imagine this. You have this country devastated by civil war. The whites and the reds, so the whites are the supporters of the old regime or the ones who resist communism, whereas the reds were basically the Bolsheviks at that time and their supporters. So they were fighting it out. At the same time there were the green movements, which are just like peasants who form up in ad hoc bands to resist the plundering of their villages by both the reds and the whites. Furthermore, there were nationalist uprisings, especially in Central Asia, which one could also maybe see as part of the green movement, but not really. Like, I mean, they are different. They have a certain agenda of national liberation and also often Islamic fundamentalism. Furthermore, you also have some, like, even the left and the right were not uniform blocks. The white movement consists of different kinds of warlords or generals who are fighting with foreign support. And the leftists, like, apart from the reds, you also have the anarchists in the Ukraine. So it's a really chaotic situation and a really bloody war. And at the same time, you have this pandemic, the Spanish flu, which is like really deadly, killing a lot of people. The cities don't have food. People don't have wood to burn to keep warm. The country is in ruins. And the urban working class was in large parts eradicated by this hunger and also by migration to the countryside. So people just saw that they cannot feed their families in the cities. So they moved to the countryside, which greatly diminished the population of the cities, which were the major populations supporting the Bolsheviks. So the Bolshevik power was strongest in the cities, and the cities were melting away. The peasants at that point mostly hated the Bolsheviks. At the beginning, they supported them like low-key, but now they were rather opposed to the Bolshevik regime. And the idealistic zeal of the early days was gone. So to quote Leon Trotsky, he puts it in really nice words. We went into the struggle with magnificent ideals, with magnificent enthusiasm, and it seemed to many people that the promised land of communist fraternity, the flowering not only of material but spiritual life, was much closer than it has already actually turned out to be. The promised land, the new kingdom of justice, freedom, contentment and cultural uplift, was so near it could be touched. If back then, 3 years ago, we had been given the opportunity of looking ahead, we would not have believed our eyes. We would not have believed that 3 years after the proletarian revolution, it would be so hard for us, so harsh to be living on this earth. So, yeah, the Bolsheviks themselves saw that something bad has happened and that the whole revolutionary process turned out to be much more difficult than they expected. So why then did the Bolsheviks keep fighting? For once, it was simply a fight for physical survival. So the white columns were running through Russia, killing all the union members, like members of trade unions, all the socialists and communists and the people who supported the Bolsheviks or were suspected of doing so. Furthermore, they killed Jews, like en masse. So when the White Army entered a territory held by the Reds, it was often a massacre. So the Reds just, like, they were fighting for their lives, defending themselves against this reactionary and anti-Semitic, barbaric hordes of the White Army. Secondly, it was about the survival of civilization itself in a certain sense. So the whites were really not united as I said, they were consisting of different generals with different agendas. You had in the white movement social revolutionaries, so leftists who were opposed to the Bolshevik rule. You also had hardcore royalist conservatives, you had liberals, you had like borderline Nazis, so it was a really it was a movement without a direct goal. The only goal was to get rid of the socialist government which was in power, but it didn't have any more substantive political vision or something like that. So it was clear to many people that even if the Reds were defeated, civil war, famine, and destruction would continue. Only the Bolshevik government was the one which had any chance of reuniting the country and getting things going again, which was ironically a reason why even some non-leftist people, just bureaucrats and army generals, decided to support the Bolsheviks because they were the only ones who maybe could save the country from total ruin. Another thing is that in 1920 the situation was very good from a military perspective. Trotsky had transformed the Red Army into a capable fighting force, and in 1919 they crushed the Whites on all fronts. So 1920, even though the country was still in ruins and people were starving and dying of cold, the armies of the Reds were advancing rapidly on the enemy and destroying them everywhere they found them. So it was a good military situation. Lastly, the whole thing, the whole revolution, was not about Russia, but about world revolution. So Lenin and his friends only did the revolution because they expected that it would be the beginning of a European revolution. So this leads us to Germany. Because the European Revolution, according to Marxist theory, had to be, like, it's necessary for the Russian Revolution. The Russian revolutionaries never wanted to implement socialism in one country. They believed that socialist revolution must be, as I said, a world revolution. And you need the machinery and the most advanced countries, which according to Marxist theory are also the ones most prone to revolution. So when in 1918 the November Revolution in Germany started, which ended the First World War and brought the left to power, there was a kind of betrayal, which was already before. Already when the First World War started, the majority of the Social Democratic Party in Germany supported the government in the war instead of holding up internationalism and trying to stop the war, which was a betrayal of the original program. But in 1918 it became clear, and then furthermore in 1919, that the majority of this SPD, the Social Democrat Party, wanted to implement a bourgeois democracy and didn't want a real socialist revolution in the country. So a fight between the left and the more right-wing Social Democrats erupted. Where figures like Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht were important leaders of the left. Unfortunately, the left was defeated, so that the German Revolution didn't really happen. So there was a revolution, but it only replaced the imperial government of the Kaiser with a bourgeois democratic government, which was officially dominated by right-wing social democrats, liberals, and Catholic conservatives, but where also the reactionary generals and the big bourgeois companies had a lot of influence. So the defeat of the German Revolution was bad news for the Russians, because they were relying on this revolution to save them and to further the whole world revolution thing. They knew that they couldn't build socialism just in backward Russia, that they need Germany to carry the torch. So when Lenin wrote the left-wing communism pamphlet, it was primarily directed to the German communists, whom he wanted to educate so that they could still try to achieve a victory of the proletarian party over their enemies. This is really important in this context. So so it is basically a work directed towards the German the German socialists, German communists, but also British and others. Yeah, learning from Russia. This is what it's all about. They should learn from the example that Russia has given them, and they should take these lessons and try to implement them in practice. So that, I mean, Lenin's perspective was that Russia, because it was the country where actually a proletarian revolution happened, can serve as a role model for others. Which does not mean that you should just do everything like the Russians did, because the conditions are also different in Germany, of course, than in Russia, or in England, they are different. But that we can get some lessons from Russia, which is the only country where the proletarian revolution was really successful. At the same time, Lenin thinks that this will change when other countries made the revolution. Then Russia will be backward again. So I quote, "It would also be erroneous to lose sight of the fact that, soon after the victory of the proletarian revolution in at least one of the advanced countries, a sharp change will probably come about. Russia will cease to be the model and will once again become a backward country." Yeah. Okay, so what, according to Lenin in his text about left-wing radicalism, are the reasons for the victory of the Bolsheviks? There are three things he mentions. First one is devotion, tenacity, heroism. So just like, we are so awesome, our party is really awesome, and this is why we did it. I don't think that this is wrong. There is a factor where it just depends on like the quality of your cadres and the leaders and stuff like this. But there's not much you can do like this. It's not really a theoretical point. It's certainly not a materialist point. It's just that you have to be a good revolutionary to be good at revolution. Second thing is contact with the masses. So Lenin stresses that only by having permanent exchange with the broader masses of the proletariat can the communists understand what they have to do. So they shouldn't just isolate themselves from the masses. They should work within the masses and therefore learn what people find important and stuff like this. So today, this would probably mean that you have to, if there's a strike, for example, in your city, maybe don't only read theory but also participate and look at the workers' movement in action, and this contact with the masses will also improve your theory. Third thing is strategy and tactics, so that the Bolsheviks had this strong strategic and tactical orientation, which today in the left is almost gone. Like, we never think about strategy and tactics anymore. And it's really important if you want to achieve something, not just present an argument why the current state of the world is bad and what the evil capitalists are doing and how the mode of production destroys our environment, but you also have to think about tactics and strategy. Now, what happens then? Lenin gives us a short history of the Bolshevik Party, which is really short, so that he uses 5 phases. First phase is the revolution of 1905 and the aftermath of this. So it was the first Russian Revolution, which was not successful in the end. It led to the creation of a constitutional government, a constitutional monarchy, for a short time, but it was really undermined by the Tsar and the conservatives. But what's interesting for the Bolsheviks is that this revolution gave them a big push. So when the revolution happened, a lot of people joined the party. The party got more and more influence on the workers' movement and could support workers in their struggles. So this was a time when they believed maybe time's near to really get powerful in this and help the proletariat win a place in this new order. But unfortunately, the revolution of 1905, 1906 was destroyed. And this was a big problem for the whole party, which he discusses in his description of the time of reaction, so 1907 to 1910, where the party was on the ground, like it was psychologically, they were really, they felt this defeat, okay? People left the party, people stopped working for the party, the membership went down, activities went down, idealism and some kind of other philosophical problems, according to Lenin, emerge. I think when he talks about this, he really doesn't mean idealism, but the ideas of Bogdanov, who I think he was a great philosopher. But I mean, the general point that Lenin wants to make is certainly true, that under the conditions of defeat, also theory suffers, and people start to just fighting each other, hating on each other, stuff like this. So the time of reaction was really a dark time for the party. Then there was a time of revival when they started to reorganize, build their institutions again, and then the First World War struck, which at first was bad news for the socialists, because the proletariat was captured by this patriotic feelings of we have to defend our country against the enemy and stuff like this. But finally, the World War led to the February Revolution, where the Tsar was deposed from power, and after this, the October Revolution, where the Bolsheviks took power. So maybe I will make some video where I go in detail about the Russian Revolution, but it's just important here to notice that Lenin gives us this description. And yeah, let's just go on, because I think if we go into the details of all of the events of the Russian Revolution and the time before it, it would take us too much time. I mean, it would take us hours to just get a rough glimpse of what happened. So let's continue. One of the first interesting theoretical points that this text about left-wing radicalism makes is about leaders and masses. So the people Lenin is arguing against are the so-called left-wing communists, which are especially strong in Germany and the Netherlands, but also some of them are active in Britain. And the German left-wing radicals, one of the points they make is that there is a divide in the Bolshevik movement between leaders and masses. That the Bolsheviks are dominated by their leaders, and the left-wing communists say that we have to build a party of the masses. So they make this opposition between leaders and masses and say, okay, it's too authoritarian, it's too top-down, we need a party which is not dominated by a few people, but which represents the whole of the proletariat. And here Lenin disagrees. He says that this whole opposition between leaders and masses is a wrong thing, that leaders represent the masses. So the masses, obviously there is no such thing as just masses, but they consist of different classes. So we mean the proletariat here, so the proletarian masses. They are represented by parties, which under bourgeois conditions is always the case, that classes are represented by parties. And parties are led by leaders, so that you cannot make this strict difference between leaders and masses. I think it's a really weak point, actually. Obviously, there is a difference between leaders and masses, and leaders can become independent of the masses, which we later saw under Stalinism. So if you have like a one-party dictatorship with a certain leadership which doesn't change, no elections, the masses have no say in politics, and then you have like 20, 30 years of this kind of dictatorship, it should be clear to everyone that the leaders don't represent the interests of the general population or of the proletariat anymore. And this is actually a point later made by Trotsky in his criticism of Stalinism. But interestingly, Trotsky makes the same point in Terrorism and Communism. So during the whole Civil War, Trotsky also wrote an important critic of Kautsky's position, and there he makes the same point that Lenin makes here. So it seems to be the case that Trotsky only really noticed the importance of the difference between leaders and masses when he wasn't in power anymore. But on the theoretical level, I think there's certainly a difference between leaders and masses, and you cannot explain this away. So here I more or less agree with the left-wing radicals on the theoretical point, but Lenin makes another point, not just denying that the difference between leaders and masses exists, but also referring to the importance of strict leadership and discipline from a pragmatic perspective. So to be able to fight the bourgeoisie more effectively, especially under revolutionary conditions, it's just necessary that we have some kind of discipline and leadership in our movement. Like we cannot decide everything democratically by assembling the whole class or even like the workers' movement. Some decisions, tactical decisions, have to be made, and therefore you need leaders. Furthermore, I mean, this is the case even for let's say, for example, the Spanish anarchists, who also had leaders. I mean, every political movement had leaders, and they needed them to win the struggle against the enemy. So in this case, from the pragmatic perspective, I think Lenin is totally right. The problem is just that you have to see both sides, and then it's just a difficult question. On the one hand, leaders are something different than the masses. Party cadres are something different than proletarians in general, and they can have their own interests and implement their own dictatorship to suppress the masses. But at the same time, they are necessary during the struggle with the bourgeoisie during the immediate revolution. So for me, the lesson would be that we have to just try to abolish these leaders or this kind of party. At least we have to implement some kind of more democratic way of controlling the socialist republic, or however you would call it, and not just have a one-party dictatorship forever. A one-party dictatorship might be necessary in the beginning, but it cannot be a permanent thing. So it has to be abolished as fast as possible. And I think that Lenin here doesn't really see the problem. He just says, oh, leaders are masses, like they are not even a different thing. The leaders just lead the party, and the party represents the masses. So it's like on a conceptual level, the problem vanishes. So this point I think is really weak, but the one about the pragmatic importance of leadership and discipline, I think is a really good argument. And here you can already see, I mean, this question of left-wing radicalism is also always a question about how authoritarian can the revolution be. But there are other points which are, I think, more important to us right now. One of them is the discussion about reactionary unions. So this refers to the trade unions, which are just organizations where the workers unite to do some strike or other actions to improve their working conditions, wages, or fight for like a reduction of the working hours, like the fight for the 8-hour day. Or today, one might say we have to fight for the 6-hour day or 30-hour week, something like this. And the ultra-leftists are really angry about socialists participating in so-called reactionary trade unions, which means trade unions who are not overtly socialist, or at least not socialist enough, like trade unions who just fight for the immediate interests of the workers, like more wages, but they don't want to implement socialism. They don't want a dictatorship of the proletariat. They are just fighting for the immediate interests of workers. So in this sense, they are reactionary, not in the sense that they are like right-wing extremists or something. They are just reactionary compared to real communists. The left-wing radicals say, and I think a lot of leftists today believe this, we shouldn't participate in them because they don't want to abolish capitalism. They just want to improve the wage a little bit. They just want to reduce the working hours a little bit, but they are basically liberals or social democrats or something like this. So we cannot associate with them. We have to create our own trade unions, which are properly socialist, and then this will increase the class consciousness of the workers. But participating in these half-ass reactionary unions, like, I used the example of Verdi, like a German trade union from our time in this picture. So to participate in these unions is just betrayal of our revolutionary ideals. And this is the position against which Lenin argues. Lenin says that trade unions, no matter whether they are socialist or reactionary, are really important because they allow the workers to organize. And of course, trade unions display reactionary features, but they actually have to. It's a historical necessity because it's a historical development. Perfect class consciousness it cannot be reached overnight. It doesn't just fall from the skies and rains down on the workers and they are now perfect communists. We can only build socialism with the people that capitalism gives us. And for Lenin, it's clear that these people must learn that they must go through certain stages of the struggle, see that they can organize, that the bourgeois is their enemy, that it's possible to win, and only through this practice they can come to a higher form of consciousness. So the reactionary unions actually have an important function in educating the workers, even if their leaders don't want to do this, even if the leaders just want to preserve capitalism. The fact that these unions exist makes them just more, it creates class consciousness irrespective of what the leaders think. So the leaders of these reactionary trade unions. And Lenin says that even when the dictatorship of the proletariat is achieved, there will still be a lot of reactionary ideas within the workers' movement, and we have to work with this. So we have to gradually change this by intervening and helping them and stuff. We cannot just condemn it and say, no, we are smarter, we have all the right theories, so we should just secede from the rest of the workers' movement and build our own thing. Most workers are found in the reactionary trade unions, if they are unionized at all. So if we want to have any influence on them, we have to move to work within these unions. Now, one more thing is that to say it really clearly, it's just wrong for Lenin to leap over this retrograde consciousness as it is, just to have this intellectual purity. And it would also be wrong to not make the revolution until all the workers are committed socialists, because this will never happen if we don't make the revolution. So it's clear that this kind of gap between the perfect socialist consciousness and the things the majority of the working class movement believes, that this gap will exist, and so we have to intervene in reactionary trade unions. For Lenin, it's just crazy to only take members who are committed to the dictatorship of the proletariat, because it's basically preaching to the choir. So if you want to convince people, you have to go where people are, and you have to view the whole development of class consciousness as this kind of dynamic, material development of the whole movement. So I think this is really interesting for us today also, because we have reactionary unions everywhere, and the left is always asking the question whether we should participate in them, whether, for example, something like Verdi, whether it's good for leftists to even support their strikes. And in this I agree with Lenin that it's generally a good thing, that this consciousness can only grow through active struggle, and this struggle at a certain stage of historical development or development of the workers' movement is to be found within the reactionary trade unions. Bourgeois parliaments. Another question that is always troubling the left until today. So, for example, what do we think about Bernie Sanders? Should we support him, or should we condemn him because he's not a real socialist, because he doesn't want the to take all of the means of production and stuff like this? So, what's our position on this? What does Lenin say about this? Again, the left-wing radicals have a really clear-cut opinion. For left-wing radicals, parliamentarism is politically obsolete. It's not something real communists should deal with. And this opinion is, as I said, mirrored by many leftists today. So just reject all parliamentary action and just make this propaganda that it's all a bourgeois game and we shouldn't even participate. Lenin says that it's not that easy. I mean, he doesn't say we should always participate in bourgeois politics. He says that it's dependent on the historical context or the specific situation in a certain country. So with regard to Russia, he believes that the boycott of the Duma, of the parliament in Russia in 1905 was totally the right call. But the same boycott in 1906 by the Bolsheviks, he admits was a mistake. He says they should have participated in the elections. They should have partaken and used the parliament to spread their propaganda and to maybe do some things which could benefit the revolution as a whole. So participation in bourgeois parliaments can be really helpful. They can be, for example, used to get a platform for spreading some ideas. If you're a part of the parliament, you are part of the parliamentary debates, the newspapers will talk about you, so you can make propaganda. You could also do something like, for example, prevent repressions against left-wing, like your own people, for example, against trade unions, stuff like this. You can use the parliament to influence politics, basically. And you can also even discredit the parliament by electing your people to the parliament. For example, by showing that there are some things that this parliamentary politics cannot give you. That when the working class thinks, okay, now we want to elect just the right left-wing people to the parliament, you have to let them do this to see the advantages, but also, and most importantly, the limitations of bourgeois parliaments, which is, Lenin believes, more easy if you participate in the parliament. Okay. Now, the practical example that plays a role here is when Lenin discusses a debate among the British communists. The question here is whether one should cooperate with the Labour Party, which was certainly not a Marxist party or a revolutionary party. It was a left-wing party, a labor movement party, but one that wasn't communist. Okay, so this is maybe a good analogy to Bernie Sanders, because before we just had this idea mainly that communists should be elected to the bourgeois parliament to basically discredit it from within. So communists get elected and then they can spread some propaganda in the parliament and they can discredit the bourgeois society. But now here in this question about the Labour Party, it's about whether we should support a non-socialist or non-communist party or not. And the British communists, many of them who were like leaning towards left-wing radicalism, for example, Sylvia Pankhurst, they wanted to clearly distance themselves from this bourgeois party, from the Labour Party, and discredited, fight against it, don't cooperate with this party. Lenin believes that this is the wrong strategy. For him, the communists should support the Labour Party against the conservatives and the liberals, because this will bring the whole working class movement further in the stage of class consciousness and class struggle that he observes in Britain. He believes that that it's just not possible to immediately make the most radical communist intervention into British politics. You have to develop the consciousness of this movement through practice, and therefore it's necessary to strengthen the unions and to give the working class some feeling of power and stuff like this, and at the same time, of course, also to display the limitations of a left-wing government. So he clearly wants the communists to cooperate with the Labour Party and to help it achieve good success in the election, without saying that those people are really our friends or that they are real socialists, but we have to cooperate with them to, in a certain sense, accelerate the movement of the proletariat to achieve some practical success. Again, we see here the same thing as with the reactionary trade unions, that Lenin's view of class consciousness, especially in this left-wing radicalism pamphlet, is a really dynamic one, where you don't just insert the right ideas into the minds of the proletarians, but you have to go through certain stages of a material development of this movement for them to have correct class consciousness, which is really nicely summarized in this quote. So to act otherwise, so to basically not ally with the Labour Party, would mean hampering the cause of the revolution, since revolution is impossible without a change in the views of the majority of the working class, a change brought about by the political experience of the masses, never by propaganda alone. this, I think, speaks for itself. Oh, before we go to the last point, one more thing. It is commonly assumed that the total rejection of parliamentary politics is a trademark of anarchism. And in theory, you might argue that it is. But in practice, things look a little bit different. I mean, look at the election of 1936, where the Popular Front, which was a coalition of different left-wing and also liberal parties who were they were fighting under a common platform to win the elections in Spain. This government, or these people, they weren't in the government in the beginning, they just participated in the election. And then all of the left-wing groups decided to support them, among them the anarchists, who for the first time didn't say that we should boycott the elections, but they actively urged their members to vote for the Popular Front, which then won the election. And I think you could say that without the endorsement of the anarchists, who are really strong in Spain, the Popular Front wouldn't have won this election. So the whole Spanish Revolution wouldn't have been possible without this strategic move to participate in the election, not as an anarchist party separate from the other parties, but just by giving your votes to the Popular Front, which was really like a bourgeois left coalition. Like there were Marxists in there, but the platform, the whole program of this thing was really moderate leftist. For the Spanish right, it was like the end of the world. But from a communist or anarchist perspective, it wasn't really especially radical or something like this. Last thing that Lenin talks about is compromise. So here, the left-wing radicals say that we should never make compromise with the class enemy or with other classes. We should just be really uncompromising with regard to our program and do everything just as our theory demands. And Lenin says, no, I mean, this cannot be the case, because sometimes reality forces you to make compromises, even with people, even with classes or political forces you don't really like, but you have to do it in order to survive or to gain more power. It depends on your strength, whether you can win, for example, a civil war. If you really know that you can't, maybe you have to make a compromise, something like this. And the question that then arises is, when is a compromise a sign of opportunism, of right-wing deviation, of betrayal of the revolution, and when is it expedient? When is rejecting a compromise a sign that you are an idealistic left-wing radical, and when is rejecting a compromise the sound and correct strategic decision? And Lenin says that basically we have no clear criteria for this. So we have to just discuss it case by case. Theory cannot give us the answer to the myriad of questions, like all of the questions that can arise during a revolutionary process. So we just have to discuss these things in detail. We cannot give a clear-cut theoretical answer to it. But one thing he mentions is, oftentimes in his writings, is the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, when the Russians gave a lot of territory to the Germans just to end the war with Germany, which was by many left-wing people in Russia, also by many Bolsheviks. They thought it was a betrayal of the revolution to give away this territory to Germany. But the Bolsheviks, like Lenin and his close circle, they believed it to be necessary to save Russia from an invasion of the Germans. And actually it worked. The Germans didn't invade, and then when the German Revolution happened, all of the territories that were given to Germany weren't German anymore. So there wasn't any long-term problems with this. But it was an important discussion within the Marxist circles at that time. And Lenin tries to defend his decision and say that, yeah, some compromises are just necessary. I mean, with regard to this compromise thing, I I would agree with what Lenin says, but I think there's just not a lot that follows from it. You can always say that some compromise someone proposes, you could always say, no, this crosses the line. This is opportunism. It's just betrayal of the revolution. And you can also claim the opposite. There is just no theoretical answer to it. It has to be, you have to look at the actual facts on the ground and not open a theory book to answer the question whether you should do or not do this compromise. Okay, what can we learn from this book? I mean, this book, I think, gives some very good arguments why we should participate in so-called reactionary trade unions. It also teaches some pragmatic relationship towards bourgeois politics. Both points I agree with. I think this is necessary if we want to further the cause of the left. And it's especially necessary today when left-wing circles, like Marxist circles, have this really strong, almost identitarian belief that they want to draw a line between themselves who have the pure Marxist understanding of society and who want to implement communism, and then on the other side the reformist trade unions and people like Bernie Sanders, like all of these retrograde elements who don't understand that the problem is capitalism itself and stuff like this. And they are right, these people do not understand what the real problem is. But we should still participate, for example, in the struggles of reactionary trade unions to build class consciousness from below, which would then allow us to later go to another stage of the revolution. So it has to be viewed as a collection of different stages where the masses, the whole class struggle gains momentum over time. And we cannot just wish that all of the proletarians had the perfect class consciousness, because they don't. And only practice can teach them. But what I don't agree with is really the thing with the leaders and the masses and stuff like this. I think it doesn't work. There is a difference between leaders and masses. There is a risk of the leaders taking over, and we saw this with Stalinism. So yeah, the thin line between ultra-leftism and opportunism, to find it is a hard thing. It's not easy. There are no ready-made answers. We just have to look at the facts, and we have to take into account different theoretical points. Like, it's just difficult. But I think that just by reflecting on it, we might be able to make better decisions in the future. And I think that's it.